All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started.
Hello, everyone. It's Nasira from Memores.
Yes, you're in.
Thanks.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Well, hello, everyone. Jennifer Boyle with Mentor Virginia, and we'd like to thank y'all for joining us today for what we hope will be a highly interactive and informative discussion. Mentor Virginia has been hosting a series of town halls and webinars to address the ever-changing scope of challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic. The communities that we serve can and have been affected by COVID in multiple ways. And one of the things that we're seeing across our communities is an increase in stress, anxiety, and trauma among children, teens, and their families. Routines are being disrupted, community and family members are falling ill, families are facing economic hardships, and access to webs of support outside of the home are limited in the name of public safety, of course. These are confusing and scary times for all of us, but it's our kids who are really the most confused and scared. We invited trauma expert John Richardson-Lauve of ChildSavers here today to talk more about how trauma is showing up in our communities and what we can do as youth-serving organizations to support young people and families through this traumatic experience. John will open up today's conversation with a brief overview of trauma, and then we will open the floor to your questions and comments for him. We hope you walk away today with some strategies for how you can best support young people and families in your community, whatever your role is. So before I hand it over to John, I wanted to introduce him. John is a licensed clinical social worker with over 25 years of experience working in the field of community mental health. His experience includes work with chronically mentally ill adults, substance abuse, residential youth care, foster care, and outpatient mental health. He is the Director of Mental Health and the lead trauma and resilience educator at ChildSavers, an outpatient mental health clinic that has served children and families in the Richmond community for over 90 years. He and his wife have a 12-year-old son and have worked with over 50 children in foster care in their home. So John, thanks for agreeing to be with us here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, Jennifer. And actually, that's a great reminder that I need to change my bio. My son turned 13 on Friday last week. Got to have a nice pandemic birthday at home. Thank you so much. I don't know, I was talking with Jennifer and Vanessa and the other folks prior to the meeting about what people's experience was with trauma-informed care and trauma education. So want to kind of bring everybody to the same baseline. Hopefully this won't be too much of a repeat for folks. And then we're going to do some Q&A and chat and see what specific questions you folks have and what we can do to support you in your work in supporting the people you work with. So a couple fundamentals about trauma and trauma-informed care and how trauma impacts people. Two of the fundamental things that we look at, the key components if we're going to do anything in a trauma-informed way, one is that we want to always respond to the need that's behind behavior rather than just reacting to a behavior. When I present to school groups, if we were all in the same room and I could get responses from you, I usually ask a question, how many of you know a kid who's been suspended from school? And I usually get a lot of hands who go up. I'm sure many of you who know kids who've been suspended from school. And then the second question, the follow-up question that I ask is how many of you know a kid who's been suspended from school and came back from that suspension with better behavior? It's not a very frequent thing. It happens every once in a while, but it's not a very frequent thing. And that's a great example of how just reacting to behavior doesn't really do a good job of changing behavior. Punishment does a great job of teaching us what not to do. Oftentimes what not to do is get caught. But what it doesn't do is teach us positive, proactive behavior, pro-social behaviors. So we want to always respond to the need that's behind behavior. If I'm somebody who's been impacted by trauma in my life, that trauma creates losses in terms of my ability to feel safe, my ability to feel power and control in my life, my ability to feel healthy attachments, my ability to release my tension, things like that. And if I'm a person who feels powerless in my life, and that's what's fueling my behavior, the behavior that you see or that society sees as problematic, because I don't feel power and control in my world, in my situation, and the consequence is to take away more power and control, is to take away that choice, to put me in jail or prison, to restrict me in my ability to feel power and control, or to feel safe, or to release my tension, then we're not going to get the results that we want. We're not going to get the better behavior. It's taken a kid with so much energy inside that they're not able to keep it inside, and they end up acting out in a classroom, hitting other kids, things like that. And then we take that kid and we put them in timeout. We make them sit quiet and still in a chair over in the corner of the room, and it's not doing anything to teach me a skill, and it's not doing anything to help me release all that energy that I have inside so that I can get it out and I can then have better behavior. So what trauma isn't is an excuse for behavior. We never want to use it as an excuse for behavior. What trauma is an explanation for behavior. And if we understand that, we can get to the other side of that and look to respond to the need that's behind that behavior. We don't give free passes, we don't make excuses. It doesn't mean we don't deal with the behavior, but we have to respond to the need that's behind that, figure out what the skill deficit is, figure out what the need is or the loss is, and start feeding some of that so that we can get that better behavior. Second key component about being trauma informed in the work that we do is we want to ask the question, what happened to you? We ask this question, what happened to you, because that understands, or it emphasizes the fact that there's a story behind behavior. And if we understand that there's a story behind people's behavior, then we can get better results. When I ask this question, what happened to you, I need to ask it out loud. That's an important thing to do. It's not always the right time or place to ask it out loud. What I want to do always is ask it in my own head. This, what happened to you, instead of what's wrong with you. What's wrong with you is just looking for a problem that we can solve. What happened to you looks for a relationship. Looks for a relationship with someone so that we can understand what's going on for them, what those needs or losses might be that's fueling their behavior and their situation, and then we can get help build that relationship and get better results. So understanding that, very important, asking this question, what happened to you? So that when I'm in a room and there's a loud bang, that I can understand that if someone has an acute reaction, somebody has a very jumpy reaction, somebody dives under a table, because maybe they've had a what happened to them story about being in a community with violence and gunshots on a regular basis. Where what I do when I hear a loud bang, I look for the door that slammed, or I look for the book that fell to the floor and made a loud noise, because I haven't been in environments for long periods of time with gunshots and community violence. And that what happened to you fuels our own individual stories and how we respond in the world. So asking the question, what happened to you, instead of what's wrong with you, and looking for responding to the need that's behind behavior rather than reacting to a behavior. So next I want to talk about our brains just for a minute and kind of what's going on in our brain. I'm sure many of you have seen what we call the hand model of the brain, but I'll do a quick review of it nonetheless, so that we can all kind of be on the same page and understand that, because it's really important for understanding what happens when people go into survival instinct. So when we use this hand model of the brain, this right here, this is our brain stem. This upper part of my arm, if we use this for the hand model of the brain, it's my brain stem. Controls heart rate, blood pressure, circulation. All of my autonomic nervous system is down here. And that's important. It does all those things, breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, all those things that I don't have to think about. My thumb, if I wrap it in here into my thumb is what we'd call your downstairs brain. If we're in science class, we'd call this your limbic brain. My downstairs brain has a lot of good stuff in it. Most important for talking about trauma, downstairs brain controls our survival instinct. Fight, flight, and freeze are down here in my downstairs brain. And then my fingers here, if I wrap them on top of my thumb, my fingers here are my upstairs brain. Upstairs brain controls relationship building, problem solving, delayed gratification, learning. All those things are up here in my upstairs brain. And that's a filter for this downstairs brain. So again, my downstairs brain, my survival brain, hears that loud noise. It sounds like a gunshot to me. But my upstairs brain can say, oh wait, I remember they're doing construction next door. Maybe the loud noise came from that. Or my upstairs brain can say, I'm in a room with 30 other people and nobody else seems really concerned about it. Maybe I can take my cues from them. My upstairs brain can filter that downstairs brain. If my downstairs brain was in charge all the time, I'd get in a lot of trouble, because upstairs brain is going to think about consequences. Upstairs brain is going to think about what relationship impact my behavior is going to have. But all of us get impacted by life stress or trauma and we flip our lid. When that trauma impacts us, we flip our lid, and then my upstairs brain is offline and my downstairs brain's in charge. And all that happens to all of us. And we want that survival brain to be in charge when there's a real reason to be in survival brain. When I'm encountering a bear in the woods, I don't want to be in relationship building brain. When I encounter a bear in the woods, I want to be in downstairs brain, in survival brain. So I can run fast, I can fight him off, or I can freeze and hope he ignores me. Fight, flight, and freeze, that's survival brain. But when we're in situations where there's not safety around us, particularly on a chronic long-term basis, like we all are right now, afraid to go outside of our house, afraid to talk to our neighbors, afraid to interact with people at stores, that safety puts us in, or lack of safety, puts us in survival brain. So that downstairs brain gets fired up, whether it's pandemic, whether it's being in an environment of community violence, whether it's living in an unsafe home, whether it's living with resource deprivation, not enough food or housing stability, that downstairs brain gets fired all the time. And the more I live in that downstairs brain, then even when I'm in a safe environment, even when I'm in a good mentor relationship, in a good after school program, in a school day, whatever that is, I don't know how to get my upstairs brain back online. And I'm always living in that survival brain. So if we understand that, if we understand about that survival brain and interact with people who are having the behaviors that we might see as less than desirable, the behaviors that we want to work out of a person, to help teach a person out of, to help a person grow out of, if we understand that we're talking to a downstairs brain, we have to understand that when somebody's like this, I can't motivate somebody with relationships because that part of the brain's offline. I can't motivate somebody with problem solving and delayed gratification and consequences because that part's offline. I can't help teach a person until I help get this upstairs brain back online because learning is in this upstairs brain. I have to calm that downstairs brain, help them feel safe and well-regulated in order to get that upstairs brain back online, in order to work on relationships, to think about consequences, to think about learning, and really build new skills. So that's the quickie version, super quick version of trauma-informed care, what that's about. Hopefully that was some new information for some folks. I think we're going to talk about, and I think as we get into questions, I think we'll get into resilience, which is kind of what we do, what we use to get to the other side of trauma and to help people grow out of it. But I will stop talking now, and I think Natalie is going to moderate some questions, some Q&A, see what we got.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Natalie Foster with Mentor Virginia, the Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships. Thank you, John, so much for that synopsis and visual. It really helps to kind of understand what's going on and how we can use a trauma lens when working with young people. So I wanted to open it up to our guests as to any questions that you may have for John. You can put those in the chat box and then we'll be able to call on you as they come in. But I wanted to, as we're waiting for some questions to come through, John, I thought I'd start you off with one. What do you think will be the long-term effects of the pandemic, on our communities, specifically on our youth?
I think it's going to be significant, the reality that we're all living through. I think it's the younger that people are, the less ability to adapt and bounce back is that they have inherent within them. And that's going to be sad. I know that for a lot of our early elementary, middle elementary, especially for pre-K, for the 0 to 5 set, that's going to be really, really difficult to not be able to go in and hug their teacher on a daily basis, to not be able to interact, especially for the kids, whether because of age or development or disability, don't have the ability to understand why they can't interact with their teacher in that physical way, why they have to social distance, why their teacher, once they return to school or to programming, why people have to wear masks when they interact with people. I think that's really going to change the reality that kids are growing up in, and that's going to change the way that brains get wired, because part of the way that brains get wired as they're developing, young developing brains, is based on interactions and relationships. And the brain pathways that get wired up and hardwired in are the ones that get reinforced. And we have to find ways to reinforce those relationships and build those relationships in new and innovative ways, since we're not going to be able to do that through our traditional ways. But I think it's definitely going to impact but we have the opportunity to adapt to that and to find ways around that. We have to focus on what's strong, not what's wrong.
Right. I think one of the other things, and like I said, I encourage our guests to jump in with some questions too, but also, how can our mentors and coordinators protect themselves against secondary trauma? I think we're all in this position where we want to help in what's next though for our mentors and our program partners in that space?
Yeah. Secondary trauma is, I think it's important to, and I will answer the question, but it's important to realize that all the mentors are dealing with their own primary trauma too. That's definitely something that we all pretty much universally are dealing with in our reality. And then secondary trauma is the trauma that we take on based on the stories or the vicarious experience of other people. And when we're working with, when you're working in a mentor relationship with someone who's been through a significant amount of suffering and adversity, then we're going to take that on too. And it's important to be able to take that on because we help in the healing of that I need to be the vessel that someone else can pour their trauma, their stress, their experience into, and I need to be able to create a holding environment for that. And if I have a hole in the bottom of my container, in the bottom of my cup that someone else is pouring their experience into, then I don't hold that very well for them. And therefore, they're not going to have the healing, positive experience that they need in that relationship. So we have to be able to be good first for ourselves before we're good for other people. Back at, after 9/11, there was a significant number of, obviously, of first responders who went to the scene and worked on saving people and rescuing people, digging through the rubble, saving lives, and then recovering bodies. And within, very early on, there was a whole bevy of second-tier responders who were psychologists, social workers, pastors, ministers, counselors, who went to be near ground zero just to help people with their experience, their emotional, psychological experience of doing that first line, digging through the rubble experience. And all they did was hear stories. These people never went to ground zero, never walked up and saw blood, saw dead bodies. Within weeks, the second tier of responders who were just hearing stories had diagnosable post-traumatic stress disorder, just from hearing stories. So this issue of vicarious trauma, of secondary traumatic stress, is very real. And when we're working with kids in general, we create that safe holding environment for them. But particularly when we're working with people who've experienced significant adversity, that can be a real challenge. So the first thing is self-care, that we need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, that I'm good not just for today. I'm not leaving it all out in the field, because then I'm not going to be any good for tomorrow too. So I need to be able to make sure that I'm taking care of myself with good self-care practices so that I am good for today and tomorrow. That old adage of putting my own oxygen mask on before I put it on somebody else. And realizing that the same things that we want to program in for resilience for other people is the same things that we need to do for ourselves to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and filling ourselves up. And realizing our limitations, what we can do and what we can't do in terms of helping other people heal and grow in those relationships, that we have to decide where those limits are so that we can preserve ourselves, again, not just for today, but for tomorrow too.
Great, thank you. I know Cody has a question. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question pose it to the group and have John respond.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just what I typed out. I'm curious to know what you feel the role of mentors can be specifically in overcoming trauma related to COVID-19 or just trauma in general, considering the fact that they're getting so many other reinforcers so much more frequently. I guess a lot of programs are seeing kids once a week or for a couple hours a day, as opposed to what they're getting everywhere else all the time. So I guess what role does mentorship play, and then maybe what is realistic to what are realistic expectations, if there can be expectations at all?
perfection would be the realistic expectation. Just kidding. I think that mentors play a really important role, most definitely, because we talk a lot about, in foster care world, we talk about, I need an unwavering champion in the world. I need someone who will have my back. I need someone who I know will support me and continue to support me. And my classroom teacher, back when we had those, you know, that's me sharing that classroom teacher with, you know, 25 to 30 other kids. And so I have somebody who hopefully I have a positive relationship with, but I don't get them as, they're not just mine. My parents, my families, unfortunately, so many of our kids don't have good, healthy relationships in those homes. And a lot of our kids, unfortunately, are living in unsafe environments or unsupportive environments. I think the magic of a mentor relationship is that it's a choice relationship, a relationship of choice, not of genetics and happenstance. So it's a relationship of choice. And I know there's somebody who's come into my life as a mentee. There's somebody who's come into my life and made that choice to have a relationship with me. And relationships are the key, or the foundation for overcoming trauma. As much as we can, we want people to feel safe. I can't do much with a person until they feel safe. And sometimes there's only so much we can do to change their sense of safety. But then after helping with safety, the cornerstone of building resilience and overcoming trauma is in relationships and attachments, those connections that we have in our lives. And I need a lot of those. But ideally, I need at least one unwavering champion. I need at least somebody who will have my back, who will make sacrifices for me, who will be there when I need them, who I can call on. And mentor relationship is a wonderful example of that, because it's intentional. It's very intentional. It's not the uncle that I just happen to have or the family that I'm happen to be quarantined with. It's people who have made an intentional choice to come into my life, who want to make a difference and help me lead my best life, help me be my best self. So no, I think trauma, whether it's COVID-19 or any other trauma of my life or the struggles in my life, I think that mentor relationship has a wonderful, almost magical quality to it, that again, it's intentional, it's programmed in, but it's sincere and it's real. Great question, Cody.
Thank you.
I know we had a question from Chantel in the chat box too, how mentors and staff can help lessen the trauma of social distancing during this time on our students. So it was kind of similar, but you know, are there specific tips or resources that programs can share with their volunteer mentors so they are equipped to support the youth during this challenging time?
I think fostering those relationships, finding as best connections as we can with folks, and finding ways to do that. Again, not focusing on what's wrong, but focusing on what's strong. Finding ways to do that in meaningful ways that are outside of the typical, that we're not able to share hugs, share handshakes, take walks together. We're not able to spend time in the same room together. All those things that are part of our reality. So we have to lean into what we can do, whether that's Zoom meetings and virtual connections, phone calls, things like that. And then finding ways for those to be meaningful, that it can be more than just a chit chat. Think about what you would normally do in a mentor relationship and work to adapt that. Whether it's, you know, playing games, whether it's doing activities, whether it's having a virtual, you know, movie watching time where you're both in separate places yet doing that and communicating on it, things like that. With those attachments, vitally important. And then finding other ways to help with the resilience of the people in that mentor relationship, of the kids, which oftentimes, again, attachment. The other two pieces of building resilience are about the second one that I talk about when we talk about resilience. The second one is regulation, that we need to help people regulate their bodies and regulate their minds. And that's really important. And it's really easy to forget that. But regulation is about how am I eating, how am I sleeping, how am I exercising, what are my routines like, how am I managing my emotions, am I really exercising my coping skills, am I engaging in regulatory activities, whether that's mindfulness and meditation, whether that's taking walks, whether that's seeking out sunshine and fresh air, those sorts of things. So we have attachment, we have regulation, and finding ways. Different people regulate in different ways. Some people like yoga, some people hate yoga. But finding things that work for the individual. And then the third pillar of that, or a third leg to that stool, is about self-esteem. We can all feel a lack of a sense of efficacy and impact in the world these days, that we're not doing much. Same thing for kids, that they're not able to get that reinforcement in a classroom situation. They're not able to be reinforced for the work that they're doing. They're not able to be reinforced in their relationships with the other kids, things like that. So finding ways to build up that self-esteem, that sense of competence, whether that's building a model or Legos, or doing a craft, whether that's doing drawing, whether that's creating something, whatever that sense of self-esteem and competence and efficacy is, looking at those three elements and looking at how that can play out within a mentor relationship, given the limitations of our interactions these days.
Great. We have any other questions from the guests? I know as we've, kind of delved into this subject, just thinking about the layer, like you said, some of the mentees may already be dealing with trauma before they came into this, self-isolation and COVID, and what that next layer looks like on top of it, how to kind of, can you talk about that a little bit? As far as,
I think that we have a real blessing. When I think of times when I've had to be I've never had to stay in my home for 6 weeks before, but when I think about times when we've been forced to stay in, it's usually some sort of weather event. It's a snowstorm, it's a hurricane, things like that. And we have the real blessing of the fact that, today, at least here in Richmond, it's a beautiful sunshiny day. It's warm outside, but not too warm. There's a lot of opportunities that we can lean into with the situation that we have, and there are ways to interact and respond. So yes, a lot of the kids that we work with, a lot of the communities that you work in, have a lot of trauma that was already in there before COVID-19. A lot of our kids already have trauma in their families, in their communities, that was already very much there. It's interesting to see the directions that those go, whether it's community violence reports that we've seen, incidences of child protective service reports across the state, particularly in urban areas, but across the state, have gone down significantly because kids aren't in childcare, after school programs, and school time, because that's where the majority of CPS reports come from. Unfortunately, the flip side of that is that even though it's a decrease in the number of reports that have been filed, it's a significant higher increase on the percentage of those reports that are filed that are founded cases, because the ones that are getting filed are much more likely to be able to be founded, because it's because the more difficult to report ones aren't getting reported. So there is still kids in unsafe situations. There is kids who are still dealing with those adversities, things like that. And a lot of our kids are having to shelter in place with people who are not safe and not supportive. So again, back to Cody's question from earlier, that mentor relationship has a lot of opportunity to capitalize on that. It's the same struggle that my clinicians are having in our outpatient clinic. We've moved everything to telehealth, and finding ways to stimulate that relationship, finding ways to engage in that when we are all kind of zonked out on screens for hours and hours of our day, much more than we used to. We're not getting that personal interaction, but finding ways to enhance those relationships, because again, relationships are going to be the key to bouncing back from this. And those relationships are with other people. Those relationships, that piece of relationships, is also about relationship with ourselves. That getting to know myself, whether that's journaling, whether that's diary writing, whether that's self-exploration, that's another layer of that there's that kind of inward focus that's okay as well as outward focus in that relationship.
Perfect. Let me open it up here to the floor. I think we have someone that would like to ask a question.
I think, yeah.
See your hair?
I think that's me.
Happy birthday to Nick Gurr.
So, sorry. So my question, I couldn't quite figure out how to type out what I wanted to ask, but how, in our role as those who are training and guiding mentors in our programs, How can we coach our mentors to understand what is and isn't appropriate in working through trauma with their mentees, or maybe like where their role starts and should stop in those relationships? How can we help them know, here's how I enter in and here's how I exit gracefully, and these are those points in which I should do so?
Yeah, great question. So what I mentioned before about asking that question, what's wrong? I'm sorry, what happened to you, instead of what's wrong with you? I was working with a regional YMCA after-school program staff and doing a training for all of them. And the director of the program had been in training with me before. And before we started the training, she came up to me, she put her arm around my shoulder, and she said, "You're going to get to that point in your workshop where you talk about asking the question, what happened to you?" And she said, "Don't say that." She said, "I don't want my 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old staff who have lived through a lot of the life struggle and adversity that a lot of our kids are living through right now, that if they ask that question, they're not going to know what to do with the answer. And there's a time and a place to ask that question, and I don't want you to encourage my staff to do that." I had some different feelings about that, but I understood where she was coming from, that sometimes we don't need to get into all that dirty laundry. And quite frankly, that's not necessary for the healing to happen. So one thing that I would say in terms of teaching and training and supporting your staff and your mentors is making sure that they don't feel like they have to be a therapist or counselor, that they need to be a friend and a mentor, and a supporter of these kids. But the best way we can do that is by, again, asking that question. Sometimes it's more appropriate just to ask it inside our own head. For instance, now's not the time and the place to ask all 30 people here to tell me the story of your life, of the worst things that have ever happened to you. What's the what happened to you story for all of you? This is not the time and the place to do that, not the time and the place for me to share my story. There is a time and a place for that. Most importantly, we need to keep that framing in our own head. So understanding that, that they don't have to be counselors and therapists in that mentor relationship. So that's really important. Understanding when it is appropriate to refer or direct someone to a professional counselor or therapist, that's also really important. Particularly when we have safety issues, when we have suicidality, when we have significant depression or anxiety, things like that, that could be benefit of a professional counselor, therapist, medical relationship. That's important too, to help people understand that, your mentors understand that, and also to seek out guidance and consultation with their leadership, with you, to ask those questions, to talk that through, is really important. And that can be hard, but it is really important to do. Keeping that in mind when you're training and supporting folks. Also, helping them understand the power that they do have in their relationships, helping them understand the power that they do have, that again doesn't have to be in that therapeutic way, but can just be in that relationship. That just being present for somebody can sometimes be the best healing power that we have to give. It doesn't take letters after your name. It doesn't take a college degree. It just takes that relationship. So being sincere, being truly engaged, being truly supportive in a strong way with somebody, vitally important.
A follow-up to that question we had from Jeanette is probably, and I realize that the mentors are not therapists in this respect, but how can we tell if a child is, exhibiting kind of symptoms of depression or extreme anxiety from the isolation, or just non-communicative when we're working with them, especially through e-mentoring?
Yeah, so if I understand the question right, that some kids are just not going to engage in this platform. They're not going to engage if they're not face-to-face. Some kids have a hard time engaging when they are face-to-face.
Right.
I think that takes some emotional intelligence on our part to understand what is engaging and what's not, and to look for different ways to engage. And part of that is knowing the kid in the first place before we had to isolate, to be socially distant. And that's really important. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't have the luxury of that. We didn't necessarily have the luxury to build a good relationship, a strong relationship, to get to know an individual before we weren't able to hang out in a direct way. So as much as we can leverage the knowledge that we already have about a person, we want to do that. And then secondary to that, if we don't have that, or are finding that to be puzzling or troublesome, we can look for alternative ways. I think that we need to engage in the forms of communication that they need, not that we necessarily need. I could stay on Zoom all day. I could stay on Zoom all day. I'm an extrovert. I love to communicate with people. I love to interact. This is my third meeting of the day. I have another one at 1, another one at 3:30. And my 3:30 is a one-on-one meeting with somebody. And we set the time, and I said, okay, I'll send you a Zoom link. And she said, I might be Zoomed out by then. I might need to, talk to you while I'm taking a walk around the neighborhood and getting some fresh air. And that's not where I intuitively go to, but it's understanding what they need, not necessarily just what we need. So with some of the kids that you're working with, it might be some sort of electronic communication, like a virtual journal or diary back and forth, some sort of letter writing, whether it's on paper or electronic. And that might be a more meaningful form of communication for them than getting on a face-to-face or a phone call, Zoom, things like that. Finding ways for them to communicate and express themselves, that it's not just necessarily this is when I woke up, this is what I had for breakfast, but finding ways to meaningfully communicate that. So that might be drawing. You can, a lot of what my therapists are doing, my clinical team are doing within the context of Zoom is they'll screen share and they'll do drawing together on the annotation on the whiteboard. And they're finding meaningful ways in that to communicate and help kids express themselves when words don't really capture it.
Great. I really like that suggestion of the whiteboard too, and the drawing, having that time when you don't have to speak. Because I know that some folks have said it is a little unnatural too, sometimes when you're communicating through the Zoom piece.
Yeah. I think in the beginning, we were all encouraging people, 6 weeks ago, everyone was encouraged, in my context anyway, we're encouraging, let's go ahead and turn cameras on. We need to see faces. We need to share. And over the past few weeks, I've heard a lot more of people giving permission in meetings. If you need to have your camera off, if you need to, kind of do your own thing, that's okay. Turn it on maybe if you have a question. But if you need that space, if you need that rejuvenating, because we are all spending a lot of time looking at ourselves on our screen in front of us, and that can be really taxing.
One of the other thing that for some of our programs that maybe are dealing with high school age kids with the proms and the graduations and some of that trauma that comes around having these large events that are no longer available to them in the way that they thought that they were going to be.
Yeah, definitely. And that is another, loss and a form of trauma. And we need to definitely honor that. We always want to honor the trauma that's there, acknowledge it, not try to downplay it. When we define trauma, we think of trauma being an event. Trauma is the event of that loss of prom or the social isolation or whatever that might be. But trauma is more than just an event. Trauma, the second, we talk about the 3 E's of defining trauma, the event, but the second E is how I experience that. And different people are going to experience the same event in different ways. And the event of losing out on prom or losing out on in-person graduation might be very different for kid A versus kid B. Likewise, I could project my own sense of how an individual would experience that. I could say, it's just prom, you've had other dances, it's not a big deal, get over it. But that doesn't honor the experience of that kid who does feel a significant loss of that event. So the second E is how they experience it. We don't get to know how somebody experiences something until we get to know them, until we lean into that relationship and understand their story, their experience of it, because that's going to be different for different people. And when we talk about trauma, we talk about this emotional experience, a sense of loss that comes in how they experience something. And then the third E is the effects that has on somebody. In order for it to be trauma, it affects them. And that, for losing prom, losing graduation, that might be that sense of loss, that anger, that sadness, that depression, that withdrawal, that social isolation, whatever how it affects somebody. And how it affects them, oftentimes when we talk about behavior problems, that's what we get to see. We get to see the kid that's pissing us off. We get to see the kid that's making bad choices. Those are the effects of that trauma and how that's playing out. That's the kid who is sick and tired of social isolation and the fact that I don't get prom and I don't get my graduation, and I'm frustrated and I want to see my friends and I don't care about COVID, so I'm going to run away. I'm going to, dip out from the house. I'm going to go play with, engage with the neighbor kids, and I don't care what people tell me to do. I don't care what mom and dad do. And that's the effects. That's the behavior. We think of trauma as being the event. That's what we get to know about. We get to know about the abuse, the loss, whatever that is. That's the first E. We think about the bad behavior, and that's the stuff that really frustrates us that we get to see a lot, is that third E. But where the money is, where the magic happens, is in that second E, how someone experiences it, because that's where that loss is created. And then we can respond to that need, to that second E, because that's going to be different for different people. Because if I'm angry and I feel powerless and I feel helpless in the world because I've lost my prom or I've lost graduation, that's a very different response that we can do to have an effective responding to that need than if I've lost graduation and it makes me feel worthless. And it makes me feel, that's different than feeling angry at the world. That's different than feeling, the world is going to end. So responding to that need in a specific way is where the magic happens. And yeah, losing prom, losing graduation, losing social time, losing those opportunities with peers is a real loss for kids these days.
I have a question if nobody else does. So as we return to, as we go back into school and our mentors are able to actually have, interactions with their mentees, and I understand that healing is on a continuum in a sense, and everybody heals at a different rate. And I guess when a mentor is with a mentee, what's the best way, after whatever it is, the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, how can that mentor kind of examine where that mentee is in terms of trauma? How do we examine that within the young people? What kind of questions do we ask?
Yeah, so definitely asking the question, what happened? What's this like for you? What's your story? How are you doing? Engage in that relationship in a meaningful way, and looking for those effects, looking for, because that's where it plays out. That's the sadness, the depression, the withdrawal, that, there's acting out, there's acting in. What are we doing to get that out, to hold that in, to contain that? Different people are going to express that in very different ways. Some people lean into that by being actually higher functioning. And whether that's cleaning my house, whether that's trying to be productive, whether that's, trying to be, perfect perfectionist kind of activity, which might not be very socially appropriate, but might be fueled by a sense of need or loss of power and control, of the need for some sense of structure in my life. And that's not a bad thing. There's a continuum of healthy and unhealthy responses to stress and trauma. But what we want to do is dig in and resolve that trauma in the first place so that we don't have to lean in those ways that are kind of counterproductive. So evaluating that, trying to figure out what's going on there is important, but it usually comes out in the context of relationship. So we want to be open to those conversations. We want to invite those conversations, but we don't need a can opener to engage in that relationship. We don't want to be prying and yanking out those things. We don't want to be pulling teeth in order for people to tell their stories, because it's really important to remember the relationship. The healing comes in the relationship and the attachment, not necessarily. You don't have to know about my trauma to help me heal from my trauma. You don't have to, and oftentimes telling that story is a part of it and can certainly help with it, but I can get the help that I need without having to tell that story. That I can heal, I can grow, I can do that internal restructuring, reprogramming, that internal healing without necessarily putting that story out there. Now, I will say stories are a lot less scary when they're on the outside than when they're on the inside, which is why we gravitate towards, whether it's journals and diaries, whether it's talking to my therapist or counselor, my mentor, whether it's drawing a picture or telling a story about it. All those things are getting the story out, and then it's a little less scary than when it's all contained on the inside. But we can still find healing and growth even if I'm not telling that story. So yes, we want to invite, create that safe space for those conversations, for that storytelling, but not mandate it. We don't want to sit our, group of kids together in a circle and say, now everybody's going to tell their story, and feel like that's an expectation that people tell their story of horror and adversity and trauma and struggle.
Let's see, do we have some other questions from guests here? I know I have been taking a lot of notes here, just the takeaways here about, the resiliency with the attachment and regulation and routines being important, and reinforcements as mentors are, interacting with their mentees, and going back to that, what happened to you, the focus on what is strong versus what is wrong in that space. And I really, love that piece where you were explaining the 3 E's, about the event, the experience. People experience the trauma differently, and, to honor that piece, and then, the effect of that as well. Very helpful as we're kind of moving through this process.
You took great notes.
Natalie, I have a question here if nobody
Sure.
else wants to jump in. So, one of the things that when we were first kind of conceptualizing what this talk would be today was also thinking about supports for families. Is that, as mentoring programs, we also have to coordinate directly with parents, especially right now for virtual relationships. So, as mentoring programs, what can we be doing? What should we be keeping in mind in terms of making sure that parents have the supports that they need right now? Are there any resources that you know of that might be particularly helpful with that?
Sure. Let's think about that. We have to understand that parents are going through the same struggles as all of us, and as their kids. And a lot of the parents that you work with, I'm sure, are not equipped and do not feel equipped to be living through what we're all living through right now. To have their kids in the house all day, every day, to be saddled with this responsibility of teacher and parent and partner or spouse and worker for those who are still working, to be saddled with all those responsibilities simultaneously. We usually get to compartmentalize those within our lives. So definitely the parents and families, guardians that you're working with are dealing with a lot with that as well. I think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that if that at that base level I don't feel safe and my basic needs aren't there, then yeah, when my kid's mentor calls me, I'm going to tell him to F off, and I'm going to tell him I don't need you right now. We're doing fine. I got bigger problems, and that's understandable, and that's going to come. That's the communication style of a lot of the families in our communities, and that is, we have to meet them where they're at and find ways to support them. And that might be about finding, helping to connect them almost as a case manager with the resources that they do need, whether that's for food, for stability, for funding, to help walk them through processes like that, and help them understand that leaning in, helping them help their child engage in that mentor relationship is actually going to help them. It's going to hopefully help that kid be less of a pain in that parent's behind, because that kid will be able to get some of their needs met, therefore be less needy in that relationship with their parent. So I always, when I work with, whether it's teachers, administrators, directors, parents, we have to always realize that they have some basic priorities that might not be as touchy-feely as ours are. They might not be as, there might be a lot more about the practical. I want this kid to stop being a pain in my butt. And as a, quite frankly, as a mentor relationship, you can help support that. You can help that parent have a little better day by helping that child get some of their needs met, which is going to help the parent get some of that parent's needs met. So helping to talk the right language, to to do that and potentially connect them with resources is really important. There's tons of stuff online. Unfortunately, a lot of the families that you work with, many of the families, I'm sure, struggle with technology in terms of access and resources or knowledge, and that's reality. But there's tons of resources online that can help folks, whether it's with those material needs in the communities that you work in, or whether it is with tools to stay sane, to be connected, things like that. So finding out what those folks need, and you might have to get some of their needs met prior to backing off and working on that mentor relationship.
So, John, I know we have about 3 more minutes with you, and Cody has one last question that we'd like to ask.
Awesome. So I think maybe the general question is, what should we be prepared for as we move into an e-mentoring environment? But I think more specifically what I'm getting at is, how might being at home and within earshot of their families affect what mentees or mentors are comfortable saying, sharing, or doing? Is there a way to know how we should expect that to impact the relationships they have? I mean, I know even for me personally, I was always uncomfortable talking to my significant other on the phone if my parents were around, or to friends on the phone if my parents were near me. And so I imagine that still exists today. So how can we prepare for that, or what should we expect?
Yeah, and we've had to encounter a lot of that same question when we've been engaging in telehealth with our kids. So I feel you in that. It can be a real struggle. Fortunately, you don't have a exclusive. We deal with a lot of confidentiality in a very rigid kind of way, and you can have more flexibility with that based on the kid's choice. But you're right, a lot of kids aren't going to feel comfortable sharing in significant ways if they're within earshot of folks, and they might not have the opportunity to go outside and do that in a safe way either, to get that separation. So encouraging them to find a safe place in their house, encouraging them to asking, where are you in the house? Do you feel comfortable, safe talking right now? Things like that. Definitely very important, being aware of the fact that they might not share as much, which means that might, be about more of nonverbal electronic communication, which might be about that texting or emailing or other kind of communication that doesn't have to rely on people with the vulnerability of being within earshot of folks. And asking those questions of, is now a good time to talk? Do you feel like you can be in a safe space where we can talk, where you feel open and sharing? Finding those ways to engage and validate the fact that that those feelings are okay. And that might be finding a time of day. That might be all sorts of other ways that you can structure that. It might be encouraging them to, whether it's find that safe space, whether it's going to take a walk. I know a lot of people who are doing kind of virtual walks together while they're, both on the phone, but sharing that space together, which can be out of earshot of folks, if that's a safe thing for your kids to do.
Thanks.
Well, John, I know you need to hop off. I'm not sure when you're eating during the day, if you're back-to-back Zooms, but I also took some great notes. I love the 3 E's, the reinforcement of confidence and accomplishment that's not happening, that we need to do now because the students are not getting that. So thank you so much for joining us. Really informative, and we're really grateful for your help today.
You're welcome. And Jennifer, I will send you an email with a few resources that you can certainly share with folks who are here today. And your
Perfect. We'll send those out with our follow-up. Great. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day. And everyone else, y'all can stay on. I think we've got a couple more things for you.
Thank you to all. Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you,
And
John.
stay strong.
Thank you.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah here now for just a moment.
So I am going to share my screen with y'all. I want to show gathering some resources for you all around the supporting families and youth right now. So if you go to the website.
Sarah, you're cutting in and out. Your audio is cutting in and out.
Okay, let me see. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think that might be better.
Is it still cutting?
No, I think it's okay now.
Okay, great. So if you head to our website at mentorva.org, if you just scroll down on our homepage, COVID-19 resources, just click on that. We've been kind of adding to since the beginning of the pandemic, and we just added a brand new section here called Resources for Supporting Young People and Families Through COVID. So it's a little plus and some basic information, training opportunities that John is hosting for free to kind of go deeper into trauma and resilience. If you keep going down, we have some resources here for supporting young people through trauma. There's early childhood, there's stuff for all ages, and stuff specifically for teen and young adults. We have some mindfulness and breathing activities for kids that we have found. There are some resources here for helping families and caregivers cope with the pandemic. There's some great resources here specifically for parents. And there's also some guidance here for that could be applicable to your mentors as well. We want to include some of the self-care resources, as John was talking about the importance of taking care of yourself so that you can take care of others. So we pulled out some of the best resources that have come our way that we've seen. And then just a couple more down here about talking to children about pandemics, and then supporting young people and sustainable services and that we're still seeing through this pandemic. So these are going to be here. We'll make sure that you get the link in the follow-up email that we send out, and we will continue to update this as we find more resources. And then I also, as we continue thinking through ways that mentoring programs can provide trauma-informed support and care to our young participants, to families, know that this is one of the many things that we can assist programs with through our program consultation services that we offer for free. So we actually have a consultant who is on our team of providers who is a licensed yoga therapist and has been working in the space of trauma-informed care for over 10 years. So she is available if you're interested in kind of working through ways that you might be able to implement some of the things we've talked about, or just figuring out ways that you can best support your youth participants and families right now. That is an avenue that is available to you, and I will make sure in the follow-up email that I send more information about how you can access that opportunity. So I will stop sharing my screen now and turn it back over to Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, like I said, we hope that you found this town hall informative. Please email us with any follow-ups that you have, any questions and resources that we can connect you with. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.